Everyone thinks they know the answer already. They say it was his mother's choice. They say it was a technicality. They say it was a quiet family decision made without drama and without consequence. Clean, simple, almost administrative. That is not the full story. When Peter Phillips entered the world on the 15th of November 1977, he became something that had not existed in the modern British royal family for quite some time. He became the first grandchild of a reigning monarch to be born without a title. Not because anyone had fought for that outcome, not because the system had been challenged or reformed or overturned, but because of a decision his parents had made before he arrived, a decision that would shape everything that followed. And the part nobody fully examines is this: that decision was not as simple as it looked. Hi, viewers. Here is a question that needs your honest answer in the comments right now. If you could choose whether your child was born into one of the most recognized institutions on earth, with all the visibility, weight, and expectation that carries, would you make that choice for them? Or would you leave it for them to make themselves? Drop your answer below. This channel wants to know. Because that is the question sitting at the heart of what Peter Phillips' parents decided. And what that decision set in motion is the part that changes how you understand everything else. It did not arrive as rebellion. It did not arrive as ideology. It arrived as something far quieter and in many ways more significant than either of those things. It arrived as a preference. And preferences, inside a system built on precedent and tradition and the accumulated weight of centuries of unbroken practice, are the most quietly radical things that exist. The system had rules. The rules were clear. The rules had produced titles for royal grandchildren across generations, had wrapped them in rank and function and the specific kind of visibility that comes with being named and positioned within one of the oldest institutional structures on earth. The rules assumed continuation. They always assumed continuation. That was the first thing the rules required. Peter Phillips' parents looked at those rules. They understood exactly what the rules offered, and they chose something else. So, if you're here for stories like this, consider subscribing, because what comes next is where it truly begins. To understand why Peter Phillips has no title, you have to understand the system that would have given him one. And to understand that system, you have to start not with Peter, but with his mother. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, daughter of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, was, by the time Peter was born, already the most thoroughly defined royal of her generation. Not because she had sought definition, because the system had provided it, relentlessly and completely, from the moment she was old enough to stand in public and be looked at. She was royal before she was anything else. The institution had preceded her personhood. The role had arrived before the woman inside it had fully formed. She understood this. She understood it with the particular clarity of someone who had grown up inside a machine and learned, through proximity and observation and the quiet accumulation of lived experience, exactly how the machine worked, what it asked for, what it gave, what it took in return, and how it took it. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through the slow, steady, completely indifferent pressure of expectation that never rested and never relented.
Children who inherit roles before they can choose them carry a specific weight their whole lives. Anne carried it. She had always carried it. And the question she faced, the question that became real and specific and impossible to avoid the moment she became a parent, was whether she would pass that weight directly to the children she was about to bring into the world, or whether she would find a way to set it down. Not for herself. She had no mechanism for setting it down for herself. The title was hers. The role was hers. The institution had its claim on her, and that claim was permanent. But for a child who had not yet arrived, who had not yet consented, who had not yet had the chance to look at the terms and decide whether they were terms worth accepting, perhaps the weight could be withheld. Perhaps the choice could be preserved. Perhaps the institution's assumption of continuation was not, in this specific instance, inevitable. Princess Anne and her then-husband, Captain Mark Phillips, made a decision before Peter was born. They would not request titles for their children. The children would be born as they were, connected by blood to one of the most powerful families on earth, but not formally designated by that connection, not titled, not positioned within the institutional hierarchy, not wrapped from the first moment of their lives in the specific kind of visibility and expectation that a title immediately creates. The decision was quiet. It did not generate a press release. It did not produce a statement. It was communicated to the relevant people through the relevant channels, and it was accepted, because, and this is the part that matters, it was within the rules. Not outside them, inside them. That distinction changes everything about how this story is understood.
The rules that govern royal titles in Britain are older than most people realized and more specific than most accounts suggest. They derive primarily from letters patent, formal royal documents that define who holds what rank and under what circumstances. The most significant of these, issued by King George V in 1917, established the framework that still governs royal titles today. Under that framework, grandchildren of a sovereign in the male line are entitled to the style of Royal Highness and a princely or princess title. Grandchildren through the female line are not automatically entitled to the same. This is the rule that applied to Peter Phillips. As the son of Princess Anne rather than a son of the sovereign himself, Peter was not automatically entitled to a royal title under the 1917 letters patent. He could have been given one. The sovereign, his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had the authority to issue new letters patent extending titles to Anne's children, as had been done in other circumstances for other family members across royal history. The title was available. It was not automatic. The distinction between available and automatic is where the real story lives. Because what Princess Anne and Captain Mark Phillips decided was not to fight the system, not to challenge its rules, not to argue that the rules were unfair or outdated or in need of reform. They decided, simply, not to ask, not to request the extension of the letters patent that would have given their children royal titles, not to use the available mechanism to bring their children formally inside the institutional frame. They left the door closed. Not locked, they did not lock it. They simply did not open it. The system does not force titles on anyone. It offers them, and the offer can be declined. This is the part that the simplified version of this story always misses.
The narrative that says Peter Phillips has no title because of some rule, some technicality, some automatic function of the system that produced the outcome without anyone choosing it, that narrative is incomplete. It removes the decision from the story. It makes what was chosen look like what simply happened. What simply happened and what was chosen are two entirely different things, and the difference between them is where the meaning lives. Princess Anne chose. The choice was available to her. She made it clearly, quietly, and completely. And the child, born in November 1977, arrived into a life that was, from its first moment, shaped by that choice, connected to the institution by blood, by proximity, by the undeniable biological fact of her grandmother's identity, but not formally claimed by the institution's hierarchy. Peter Phillips was born without the title. What that would actually mean, what it would cost, what it would make possible, what it would require of the person living inside it, that was not something anyone could have fully calculated in 1977, but it was coming.
Growing up without a title inside a family defined by titles is its own particular education. It does not produce distance. That is the first misunderstanding people carry when they think about Peter's childhood. The assumption is that the absence of a title meant the absence of proximity, that Peter grew up somehow removed from the center of the institution, insulated from its weight, protected from its expectations by the legal fact of his untitled status. The assumption is wrong. Peter Phillips grew up at the center of everything. He was Queen Elizabeth's first grandchild, not her first titled grandchild, not her first royal grandchild, but her first grandchild, full stop. The relationship was personal before it was institutional. He knew his grandmother not as a function, not as a ceremonial figure encountered at formal distance, but as a person encountered at close range across the ordinary rhythms of family life. Balmoral in the summer, Windsor at Christmas, the specific texture of a family that happened also to be one of the most observed families on earth. He attended those gatherings as himself, not as a titled member of the royal family, not as a prince with a defined role within the institutional hierarchy, as a grandson, as a nephew, as a cousin, as a boy and then a young man who was connected to something enormous by the most basic human connection that exists, the connection of blood and love and the shared experience of growing up together. What that position gave him was unusual and, in retrospect, almost impossible to replicate. He had access to the inside without being consumed by it. He could watch the institution operate at close range without being subject to the full weight of the institution's expectations. He could observe how titles functioned, what they asked for, what they produced, what they extracted from the people who held them, without those observations being about his own situation. He was, in the most precise sense, an informed outsider, someone who understood the system from proximity without being fully inside it. That position produces a specific kind of clarity that proximity alone never could. The titled members of his family carried something he could see but not fully feel. Not because he was indifferent to it. You cannot grow up that close to something enormous and remain indifferent. But because the thing was not on him. The expectation was not directed at him in the same way. The institutional eye that watched the titled royals with particular intensity, that measured their public behavior against the requirements of their rank, that processed their personal decisions as institutional events, that eye moved across Peter and kept going. It did not settle. It did not press. He was visible, but not claimed.
and the difference between being visible and being claimed, between being seen by the institution and being owned by it, is the difference that shaped everything that followed.
There is a moment in the life of every person who grows up adjacent to power when the nature of that power becomes undeniable. Not theoretical, not observed from a distance. Undeniable in the specific, personal, physical sense of something that presses against you and asks you to accommodate it. For Peter Phillips, that moment arrived not as a single event, but as a gradual accumulation of clarity, a slow understanding built across years of observation of what the institution actually was and what it actually asked of the people inside it. He watched cousins receive titles and watched what the titles immediately did to them. Not what the titles did dramatically, not what they produced in terms of crisis or confrontation, but what they did quietly. The way a title shifts the air around a person, the way it changes what is expected of them in any given room, the way it arrives with an invisible but completely real set of requirements that have nothing to do with who the person is and everything to do with what the institution needs them to represent. He watched relatives navigate public appearances and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had never been required to do the same thing in the same way, how much of that navigation was performance and how much was genuine, and how, over time, the line between the two things became impossible to locate. The performance becomes the reality, the role becomes the person. Not because the person is weak, not because they have failed to hold on to something essential, but because the institution is patient and consistent, and it applies its pressure across years and decades in a way that no individual can fully resist simply by being aware of it. Systems shape people whether those people choose them or not, but the shaping is deepest when the choice was never offered. Peter's choice had been offered, or more precisely, it had been made for him before he was old enough to make it himself, by a mother who understood the system well enough to know what she was doing when she declined to hand it to her children at birth. And the effect of that prior choice was that Peter grew up with a version of the question that most people born into similar circumstances never get to consider. He grew up knowing, at some level, that the institutional weight was optional. Not easy to escape, not cost-free to decline, but optional. A choice rather than an inevitability. Something that had been looked at, assessed, and, by the person most responsible for his beginning, declined. That knowledge is rarer than it sounds. Most people who grow up inside powerful institutions absorb the institution's fundamental premise, that belonging to it is natural, that its terms are simply the terms of existence, that the alternative to acceptance is not a different path, but no path at all. Peter grew up with evidence, embedded in the fact of his own untitled existence, that the alternative existed. That someone standing where his mother stood had looked at the offer and said, "Not for my children." That evidence mattered more than anything that could have been taught. The question people most often ask about Peter Phillips and his lack of a title is the wrong question. They ask, did he ever want one? That question assumes the title was the primary thing, that its absence was the defining feature of his life, that the untitled state was a gap to be filled, or a loss to be mourned, or a position to be reconsidered as he grew older and understood more fully what the title would have meant. The question inverts the reality. The title was not the primary thing. The life was the primary thing. And the life was shaped not by the absence of something that was never offered, but by the presence of something that was consistently, deliberately, quietly maintained,
the space that the absence of a title created. Space to build a professional identity that belonged to him. Space to make mistakes that did not become institutional events. Space to be a person in public rather than a role in public. Space to navigate the ordinary difficulties of an adult life, career, relationships, the gradual construction of a self, without every decision being measured against the requirements of a rank he had not chosen. That space was not an accident. It was the inheritance his mother's decision had given him. The most valuable things we receive are often the ones we never have to ask for. Peter Phillips built a career in sports management and business. The career was his, not a reflection of royal standing. There was no royal standing to reflect. Not an extension of palace positioning. He had no formal position within the palace to extend. Built on professional reputation, sustained by professional relationships, accountable to the frameworks that ordinary professional life provides. He was photographed at royal events because he attended royal events, as a family member, as a grandson, as someone whose biological connection to the institution was permanent, and whose affection for the people inside it was genuine. He was present at Ascot, at Christmas gatherings, at the public moments that mark the rhythm of a family's shared life, but he was present as himself, not as a function, not as a role, as a person who happened to be connected by blood and by love to something much larger than himself. That distinction between being present as a person and being present as a role is one that the institution, for all its considerable sophistication, has never fully managed to erase from the people it does not formally claim. Peter was never formally claimed, and so the distinction remained. There is another dimension to this story that the simple version never reaches. The decision Princess Anne made not to request titles for her children was not made in isolation. It was made in the context of a woman who had spent her entire life understanding, at close and sometimes painful range, what institutional belonging actually costs. Princess Anne became the Princess Royal in 1987, a title that recognized her extraordinary record of public service. She had been one of the hardest-working members of the royal family since her earliest adult years, representing the crown at hundreds of engagements annually, carrying out the institutional role with a consistency and commitment that even her most critical observers acknowledged. She competed as an equestrian in the 1976 Montreal Olympic Games, the only member of the British royal family to have done so, earning her place on the team through sporting merit rather than royal connection. She understood what it meant to earn something, and she understood what it meant to be given something. The specific weight that a given thing carries, the specific obligations that attach to it, the specific way it shapes the life of the person who holds it, whether that person consciously accommodates the shaping or not. When Anne chose not to request titles for her children, she was not rejecting the institution. She was, in her own way, protecting her children from a specific aspect of it, the aspect that arrives before a person is old enough to understand what they are accepting, that shapes them before they have fully formed, that wraps their identity in a frame they did not choose. The most protective decisions are sometimes the least visible ones. She gave them the blood, she gave them the proximity, she gave them the family, the grandmother, the history, the connection to something ancient and significant and genuinely unlike anything else on earth. What she withheld was the formal claim, the institutional designation, the specific act of the system reaching out and saying, "This one is ours." Her children were never formally designated as the institutions. They were hers, and then, as they grew, they became their own. Peter Phillips became his own, not through rebellion, not through a dramatic act of self-definition, not through a public statement or a carefully managed departure from the institutional frame, simply through the ordinary, consistent, daily business of living a life that belonged to him, because the decision made before his birth had ensured that no prior claim had been entered. He did not have to refuse a title. The title was never formally offered because the mechanism for offering it, the request from his parents, the extension of the letter's patent, was never set in motion. He was born outside the frame. He grew up adjacent to it. He built his life beyond it.
What Peter Phillips's situation reveals about the institution is something the institution has never publicly acknowledged and almost certainly never will. The system depends on inheritance, not just the inheritance of property or position or wealth, though those things are present, but the inheritance of belonging. The assumption that the children of those inside the frame will themselves be inside the frame, that the institutional claim passes from generation to generation as naturally and inevitably as the biological facts of descent, that the continuity of the system is maintained not through force, but through the accumulated weight of what is simply assumed to follow. Peter Phillips broke that assumption without breaking any rule. The letter's patent had not required his parents to request a title extension. They had simply assumed they would. The system had operated on that assumption for long enough that the assumption had become indistinguishable from a requirement. Nobody had needed to enforce it because nobody had ever declined to fulfill it. When Princess Anne declined, the system had no mechanism to respond, because there was nothing to respond to. No confrontation, no challenge, no visible deviation from any stated requirement. Simply the absence of a request that the system had never formally required, but had always expected. The most effective departures are the ones the system has no protocol to address. And what followed, what Peter's untitled life produced, was something the institution could observe but not manage, a functioning, visible, publicly present member of the extended royal family who existed outside the institutional hierarchy, who attended family events without occupying an institutional role, who built a professional life without requiring the institution's endorsement, who raised children, Savannah and Isla, his former wife Autumn Kelly, who are themselves untitled, carrying the same inheritance of unchosen freedom that their father carried before them. The pattern continued. The choice, made once by Princess Anne before Peter was born, propagated forward through a generation. Savannah and Isla are the great-grandchildren of Queen Elizabeth II. They are connected by blood to the center of something centuries old, and they are untitled. Not because anyone fought for that outcome, because the decision made in 1977 simply remained the operating framework, quietly, without requiring renewal. Choices made once can shape lives across generations.
Every path carries a cross. The path Peter Phillips's life took, the untitled path, the professional path, the path that existed outside the formal institutional hierarchy while remaining connected to the institution by every other available thread. That path carried a specific cost that the simplified version of this story almost never names. He gave up a form of significance that cannot be replicated through professional achievement. A royal title is legible instantly and universally.
It requires no explanation, no context, no knowledge of the field in which it was earned. It communicates position and belonging and connection to something ancient and durable in the single immediate fact of its existence. The doctor becomes more significant when they hold a title. The business person becomes more visible. The family member becomes more present in the public imagination, not because of anything they have done, but because of what they are within a structure that assigns significance independent of action. Peter Phillips has never had that form of significance. What he has had, he has built. The recognition he carries in professional contexts belongs to him because he earned it through competence, through relationship, through the daily work of building a reputation in fields that measure their participants on professional terms. That recognition is his in a way that a title could never be. It cannot be withdrawn, cannot be managed by an institution, cannot be adjusted to serve someone else's purposes. But it is also limited in the way that earned recognition is always limited. It reaches as far as the knowledge of the field reaches, and no further. The untitled path is wider than it looks and narrower than people assume. It is wider because it carries none of the obligations that a title brings. Peter has never been required to represent the institution at formal engagements, has never had his personal decisions processed as institutional events, has never had a palace communications team measuring the distance between who he is and who the institution needs him to appear to be. That absence of obligation is a real and durable form of freedom. It is narrower because the specific kind of influence that proximity to institutional power produces, the ability to open rooms, to be consulted on matters of significance, to occupy a position in the public imagination that operates independently of personal action, that influence was never available to him. It was adjacent to him always, close enough to observe, never close enough to hold. He grew up watching people hold it. He watched what it did to them, and he watched what it gave them, and he understood across years, and with the particular clarity of the well-positioned observer, that both things were real, both the cost and the benefit, both the weight and the significance. He did not carry the weight. He also did not hold the significance. That is the honest accounting of what the untitled path produced.
The real question is not why Peter Phillips doesn't have a royal title. The real question is what his existence without one reveals about how the system actually works. Think about that for a moment. A man born as the first grandchild of a reigning monarch, connected to the institution by the most direct biological tie available, present at its most intimate gatherings across his entire life, raised in full knowledge of what the institution was and what it offered and what it asked for in return, lived his entire adult life outside its formal hierarchy, built a career, raised children, constructed an identity, did all of this without the institutional designation that the system had always assumed would follow from his position. And the institution continued. The monarchy did not fracture. The system did not require his formal inclusion to sustain itself. He was there, consistently, personally, genuinely, and he was outside the frame, consistently, formally, completely. Both things were true at the same time. That simultaneous truth is what unsettles the simple version of this story, because the simple version wants the untitled state to be either a deprivation or a liberation. Either something was taken from Peter Phillips, some recognition he deserved and did not receive, or something was given to him, a freedom he was fortunate enough to inherit from his mother's clear-eyed decision. The simple version wants a verdict, a clear accounting of whether the untitled life was better or worse than the alternative would have been. The honest version refuses that clarity. The honest version says both things were true.
The freedom was real. The cost was real. The life was his, and the life had the specific shape that it had, the professional character, the relative privacy, the ability to be present without being claimed, because of a decision made before his birth by a woman who understood, from the inside, exactly what she was protecting her children from. What we inherit shapes us even when we never asked for it. Princess Anne gave her son something the institution could not give and could not take away. Not a title, not a position, not a place within the formal hierarchy that assigned significance independent of action. She gave him the condition of his own life, the basic, durable, quietly extraordinary condition of being a person before being a role, of arriving into the world without a prior claim entered against his identity, of having the chance to build himself before the institution had the chance to define him. That gift is invisible in the way that the most important gifts always are. You cannot photograph it. You cannot document it in a letter's patent or announce it in a formal statement. You can only observe its effects across a life, in the career built on professional merit, in the children raised outside the institutional hierarchy, in the public presence that has remained, across decades, recognizably personal rather than institutionally managed. Peter Phillips is the eldest grandchild of Queen Elizabeth II. That biological fact is permanent and irreducible, but he is also something rarer inside the specific world he was born into, a person who was given the chance, before he was old enough to ask for it, to be himself first. Not a royal who chose to step back, not a rebel who fought the system, not a tragedy or a triumph or a statement or a departure. Just a person living a life on terms that for once began with him rather than with the institution. And the question that remains, the one this story leaves with the person watching it, is not about Peter Phillips at all. It is about the frames you were born into before you were old enough to choose them, the institutional claims that were entered against your identity before you had formed one, the titles, formal or informal, named or unnamed, that arrived before you did and shaped the space you were given to grow into. And whether, if you had the chance to make the decision that Princess Anne made, to withhold the frame, to preserve the space, to give a child the condition of their own beginning, you would know what you were giving. Take your time with that answer, because the most significant inheritances are almost never the ones anyone talks about. This story does not end here. There are more lives inside this institution that history recorded one way and the full account suggests another. Stories of people who stayed and people who left and people who were never formally inside and never formally outside and lived their entire lives in the particular, instructive, under-examined space between. If this story gave you something to think about, if it showed you something about power and choice and inheritance that you had not fully considered before, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Every story on this channel is built for the person who wants to understand what is actually happening beneath what is officially recorded. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments and start the conversation. The next story is coming, and it is one the official record never fully explained.